Okay, so this is a big question. So I'm going to read through this little banter back and forth with a reader of mine, and I will answer a little bit of it here, but then I will go back and in subsequent videos answer each of the questions separately as well. So we can have an idea of what the whole question is first. So, the question being, can you help some of us who are non-Catholic Christians with a lot of the beliefs that we struggle with? And so we're going to make a good faith effort to, handle some of those as presented to me by this reader. So she said, "You've helped me so much. I wish I knew more about you. Christians especially. I never realized it until now. I was in a service where a pastor was talking about the Catholics negatively and about purgatory and there not being such a thing. It's not in the word," he said, so to speak, message, and my antenna went up. If there is any way that you can do a video for those of us Christians who are not Catholic to help us through what you have been shown and what you know, that would be really helpful. I can tell you from my strict upbringing, there are many who won't sadly listen or read your books because of being Catholic and also espousing to knowledge other than religions and the whole mystical thing. Not to bring you down, but these same people have no problem watching sci-fi movies, reading Harry Potter, of which I never have, she says, horror flicks, sexual movies, and books like Shades of Grey, and then go to clubs and drink and preach on Sunday. I find it very hypocritical. One of the reasons I'm on the path I am, and you are. God touched my soul and spoke it into my being. You must stop this. This is not who you are. Repentance started from there. Christians need a good, simple video of Purgatory World 101 without pictures or anything, images, just straight up talking and sharing like you did. What you see and experience as God has shown you, for those more visual than readers, I had to share. I feel empathically their energy, a gift I've always had. Thank you, and I love you. So this is my response to that. I was like, I would love to do this. Can you send me some questions with the specific difficulties that non-Catholic Christians face? I'll do this one, but can you tell me the specific difficulties I can address? And I will do so on the Q&A channel. Thanks so much. Love me. And this is a fascinating response. And it says, "Thank you. Yes, I will do this. I appreciate your helpfulness and thoughtfulness. Anything I can do to dispel false teaching and programming from my childhood not only helps me, but many in various churches. So many lay leaders do not teach spiritual truth as they've not experienced it." It's a good point. "One of the reasons I don't attend church and have it. My recent time with my sister and going to her small non-denominational church produced a sermon on purgatory and more or less the praying for souls in purgatory, which did not make sense since once Jesus has saved you, you either accept him or you go to hell. I guess they don't believe there's such a realm, that souls can be prayed for, and that this world is a purgatory world where we are here to purge our lower natures. They have no concept as to why we are even here. So much ignorance. All that has been withheld from humanity has kept souls in a slave mentality to not rise above." And that's part of the problem. If we don't rise above these things, I'm going to move this up a little, we don't progress. That's an excellent point. What it truly means to be born again in the Bible has also been distorted. Reincarnation to Christians is a big no-no. We die, we go to heaven. Of course, I do not ascribe to this, as God has opened my eyes to this. I don't know my past lives, but speaking about it has stirred some charged discussions. I do know that. I do know how to form the questions and a few others. I will work on it. They also do not believe in your Bible. I think she's referring to the Catholic version of the Bible, as it has many other books that are not in the Holy Bible. The same, containing the books of the Old and New Testament, are to be believed. The apocryphal books and others that did not make it into the canonized version are not viewed as, quote, the Word. It's sad, actually, that so many have missed out on so much, like the Essenes, Enoch, the Lost Books, etc. I will think on the specific questions and get back with you. Thank you. You have pierced the veils to be taught directly in spirit body from the Lord, Mother Mary, Masters, etc. I trust you and God bless you. There's a lot in here. And she did subsequently send me this following email, which I will deal with the questions in their subsequent order in separate videos. But I'd like to deal with some of these thoughts here. So there's a lot here on purgatory, reincarnation, and the difference between the Catholic Bible and the non-denominational Bible, the Protestant Bibles, and possibly a little bit here on non-canonical texts. So, boy, where do I begin, huh? We can talk more in detail on purgatory, reincarnation in subsequent videos, but we want to talk about it just from the standpoint of the Bible in this video. And what that entails here, there are actually books on these subjects that are really, really well done. There's a book called, I don't remember the exact title, but you can look it up. You'll find it. It's a Bible study on purgatory in the Bible. So you want to look up something like the Bible taught purgatory or how the Bible taught purgatory. It's an excellent book that it really lays it out as to how the Bible did teach purgatory. Some of the things within it that you're going to see are going to be the fact that even from the time of the Old Testament, the Lord our God told us to pray for the dead. And that was in one of the books that's considered apocryphal, so non-canonical, in the Old Testament, the Maccabees. But what the Catholic understanding of that is that you pray for the dead because it has a reason, it has a purpose. So if praying for the dead served no purpose, God would not ask us to do this. And so these are some of the basic elements that begin the understanding of how purgatory was taught in the Bible. But you can pick up books that actually talk about this as well as how reincarnation was taught in the Bible. Reincarnation being taught in the Bible is much more obvious in that you have, first of all, and you go back to, this really applies to both, but I'm going to, the ancient Jews believed in reincarnation. They also believed in praying for the dead. That's what they did. So you have to look at Christ from the lens of him being a Jew, a practicing Jew. And then you can understand his words from the standpoint of what he is known to have believed. So when he's asking the apostles, who do people say that John the Baptist was? And they say some say he was Elijah or Elisha. And some people say that you were somebody. That is a reference to reincarnation. There are other references throughout the Bible to reincarnation. Jesus did not correct them. He did not say, that's wrong. Why would you say such a thing? He said nothing because it was an accepted belief of the Jews in reincarnation. There's other references like these. If you're very interested in understanding how the Bible has references to purgatory and reincarnation, look at these studies. There are excellent books that go through and literally walk you through step by step every single one. So that's available to you. And our third question was this. This is something that I think is unfortunate because it's really just a basic misunderstanding. You know, it is easier to misunderstand the doctrine of reincarnation or purgatory because most Christian denominations, including Catholicism, currently don't accept it. Remember, though, that reincarnation is something that was accepted by many in the early church. They actually voted it down by one vote at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. So it was such an accepted belief in the early church, they had to have a vote. And it was literally like a 5-4 vote or something like that. So this is not an unpopular belief. It was something that you can find in the writings of some of the early church fathers, like Origen, and some others. Some of the books on reincarnation will talk about where you can find the references to it in the writings of the early church fathers. So this is not something that is just so far out of, outside of all reason. It literally was a point of contention all the way back to the early church, where you had schools of thought which believed in reincarnation and schools of thought which did not. And purgatory was something that was generally believed from the very beginning. And it was believed even before the beginning of Christianity. It started with Judaism. That's important that people understand that Jesus was a practicing Jew. So it started there, and there were certain beliefs. You can also look at my book, The Mysteries of the Redemption. And if you do a search on the document, you can download all of my books for free at outofbodytravel.org. Go to Out of Body Books, find The Mysteries of the Redemption, look up reincarnation. There is a section in the early part of the book where I shared some supporting scriptures for these issues from some early church fathers and from the biblical texts. It's not all inclusive. It's just a demonstration of some of the elementary understandings of it. But there are texts that you can consider. And in fact, if you're interested in more of those, you might try Reincarnation, an East-West Anthology. Then you have, I'm having to remember these off the top of my head. I'll just let you stick with that one for now. I have a whole series of books in my library, about 12 of these, that discuss reincarnation in the Bible and reincarnation in the writings of the early church fathers. And so they are available. Even just look it up on Amazon or on your search engines. Look it up on your academic sites. People write research papers on this all the time. So this is not an uncommon thread of discussion. Purgatory comes about because people prayed for the dead from the very beginning. And there is a theological understanding that we deduce that from this we can deduce this, from this we can deduce this. If it is good to pray for the dead, then we can deduce that there is a reason why it is helpful to them. And then we also have the body of the mystics, which is, in the Catholic mystics, but there's also the Jewish mystics, and there's a whole bunch of mystics from throughout time and the ages. So we have, and I'm just trying to deal with the biblical part of it here. We'll deal with it in another video. I wish I had my library available to me right now, but I don't. So doing the best I can. One book here, Why Jesus Taught Reincarnation, Herbert Puryear. That is a book you can get about the Bible and reincarnation, and that will give you quite a bit to go with and get started on. Apocryphal and non-canonical texts. Let's take care of that one while we're here as well. So here's the thing, okay? The Holy Bible is a Catholic book. It was put together and compiled and canonized by the Catholic Church in 325 AD. We have to remember that all Protestant denominations, with the exception of the Anglicans and the Orthodox, occurred in the 1500s, which is almost 1,200 years later. And they came up with their own translations. They removed books. Martin Luther made a couple of actual changes to words, where he changed in the book of St. James, sola scriptura, which is not the actual original translation, which means scripture alone. That is what the Protestant basis has been, where they've tried to remove the other requirements that Christ had given, which was tradition, the magisterium, which is the teaching authority of the church, and the sacramental authority of the church. These were things that they were trying to diminish in importance, and that's what they did, and they actually changed the wording in that text. And I have gone back and done all the research to validate that. I'm not telling you that just because someone told me that. So that's what happened there. So what you have is that the Protestant denomination chose to remove a certain number of the Jewish books. Now remember, these are books that the Jews themselves also consider canonical in their Old Testament. So they removed books that the Jews consider canonical. They also removed some books that the Catholics considered canonical. And now these books to the Protestant denominations are considered non-canonical or apocryphal texts. All that means is that the Protestant denominations chose to do that. The Bible was canonized by the Catholic Church in 325 AD. Calvin and Martin Luther were responsible for the changes made to it in the 1500s and subsequent, when later you're going to have King James come in and do his own translation, and you have various translations along the way. I wrote a book called Protestant Reforms, which I highly recommend to any of you who are interested in this subject. It's a very thick book, but you can download it and look up for whatever information you're interested in. The purpose of the book was to give people the information regarding the Protestant Reformation that would be what I consider to be the most important. That was for me in my journey, my spiritual seeking. And that would be the year that a sect was formed, the reason for the schism from the previous sect, and the various things that they changed and why. And I'll tell you, with the exception of about 5 of the 30,000 denominations which were formed, they were all formed because of human disagreement. Okay, so what happened with Calvin and Martin Luther was human disagreement. You have a few denominations. These include Methodism, Swedenborgianism, the Mormon faith, the Seventh-day Adventist claim continuing revelation. These are the ones that were formed because of a very dynamic founder who had either visions or really obvious spiritual gifts, like with John Wesley for the Methodists, had a profound gift of the being able to bring people to the conviction of spirit, conviction of their sins. Swedenborg was a profound mystic. Joseph Smith had mystical experiences that he claimed. The Seventh-day Adventists claimed like word of knowledge messages. I'm trying to think if I know that there's others. I'm just not remembering them all off the top of my head, but those are your basic few that are going to have anything other than human disagreement that caused the formation of another denomination. So the only one that goes back to the early church fathers, the only one that goes back to the apostles of Christ and Jesus himself, is the Roman Catholic Church, and some can say the Orthodox. And the reason this is the case is because you have St. Paul, who was the apostle to the Roman Church and to all these lands. Every one of the other apostles was sent out to basically preach to the world, and they created different versions for each apostle in these different locations. So for instance, St. Mark was in Egypt, and they have the Coptic liturgy there. You have St. James was the bottom line in what ended up causing the Orthodox Christianity, which came out from St. James and some of the apostles. You have the other apostles, which created the Roman Catholicism side. So you have Roman Catholicism, Orthodox Christianity, and that includes the Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, different types of orthodoxy that you see all over Europe. And those were actually created by the apostles of Jesus. Then you have the Anglican Schism, which happened somewhere around 12 or 1300, and that was because of King Henry VIII and his many, many wives and his divorce claims. And so that was human disagreement. And then you have in the 1517 with James Calvin or John Calvin, and then 1562, where you start really seeing the Protestant Reformation take a major surge with Martin Luther and his 99 Theses. Now, within 300 years of that time, the Catholic Church had addressed all 99 of those theses because they understood they had to make changes. A lot of Catholics say Martin Luther wasn't completely wrong. He was just impatient. There were some things that he was very questionable about. He had a great hatred for the papacy, and he had a great hatred for a lot of things that were related to the Catholic Church. Some people felt that his position on certain sacraments, like that of confession and others, had to do more with some personal issues he had, which were more related to a condition we know as scrupulosity, meaning that he didn't feel worthy of being forgiven for anything, which is actually a totally different thing than what ended up happening, where much of the Protestant Reformation ended most of the sacraments. In the Catholic Church, we have 7 sacraments. In the Protestant churches, you can have anywhere from, average 1 to 3. And the remaining sacrament in most churches is the sacrament of the receiving of the holy bread. In the Catholic Church, this is the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist. And so it has great meaning for Catholics because we believe in transubstantiation, whereas the Protestants changed it to consubstantiation, which significantly diminished the role of the Holy Eucharist from the real presence of Christ to the spiritual intention of Christ. So a spiritual sign, symbol, etc., etc. So what you have, going back to where we started, is these texts they are they are only apocryphal because the Protestants in 1562 took them out of the canonical Bible of both the Jewish faith and the Catholic faith. And the Old Testament is a Jewish book. The New Testament is a Catholic book. It was put together by the Catholics. It was given to the apostles who gave it to the early church fathers who founded the church. So you have to understand who can criticize the book that was created by the Catholics and say that these are apocryphal books. So you have the Protestant Reformation comes in, takes out these books, Jewish and Catholic, and so these are now apocryphal, which I guess I'm saying, hope it's clear. I think that's ridiculous. You don't, it's like me going in and saying, you can take out this, 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 and this out of the Holy Quran. And it's about it's just as valid as me doing that. That's something that would be very disrespectful of me to do to an Islamic book and think that it's valid just because I said so. And so that's the nature of what it means to have an apocryphal book. So being apocryphal does not mean it's actually not in the canon. It was placed in the canon originally by the Jews and the Catholics. It was the Protestant Reformation that chose to remove it. And so you can come to your own conclusions. There's a lot of stuff you can study on this. So you don't have to take my word, but definitely you can utilize Protestant reforms. It also has all of the articles of confession and things like that of each of these different faiths, so you can compare and contrast what they all believe. No question that all of these faiths intended to follow Christ in the best way possible that they felt was the best way possible. But for my own journey and for what I was shown mystically all these years, I was shown you can't ignore the evidence that leads to the fact that Christ only founded one church. So I'll leave that there. Now, when we talk about the non-canonical texts, like my friend here, my new friend, she talks about like the Essene books, which ironically, many of those have only been translated recently. The books of Enoch, the lost books of the Bible, and the forgotten books of Eden. Those are not considered those are non-canonical texts. They were never in the canon of any version of the Catholic or Jewish Bible, but they are interesting books. I'll have you on that. I'm very interested in the non-canonical texts. So what I always say about these non-canonical texts, they are in existence. We're lucky to have them. The church does not consider them authoritative. And so what we did in Catholicism, what our Catholic Church did, was to choose which books would have teaching authority in the church. And we have what's called the Magisterium of the Catholic Church, which tells us how to interpret certain teachings within our biblical scriptures. And that includes, the bishops, the cardinals, and all that stuff. They have a certain teaching authority so that we're not all just interpreting the Bible however we want, and, that everybody can have their own opinion and everyone can be all over the place and everything is okay. There has to be an understanding of what this means, and that is coming from Christ himself and the apostles. This is what was intended. Okay, so I'm not saying that because we're all trying to be control freaks here. We're saying it because that's what came from Christ to the apostles and then to the early church fathers, that this teaching authority was something that needed to be transmitted to future generations. That's what is happening there. So what these non-canonical texts are, these are books that were written that are often ancient sacred texts. They were written by other people. They were not given the status of teaching authority or canon. Now, I compare this a lot to the books of Buddhism. So, for instance, in the earliest forms of Buddhism, Theravadan Buddhism, they have what is known as the Pali Canon. And the Pali Canon is, some of the first and most important books about the Buddha and the writings and not the writings because he didn't write them, but his dialogues and his thoughts and the things that he said, the stories he told the Buddha. There's like 200 volumes. So what the Buddhists did was they didn't choose to canonize any of them. They just have the Pali Canon. All of them are available for any practitioner to study. And so that was like an alternative way to handle that issue that the Buddhists applied to the Buddhist texts, which was, we're just going to keep them all. We're not going to try to figure out which one is of higher authority or not. We're just going to keep them all. In the Catholic faith, they decided to choose which texts would be given that kind of authority. Now, interestingly, in the Jewish tradition, we have what's called the pseudepigrapha, which would be the non-canonical texts of the Old Testament era. And so you have some books which were not given canonical status in the Old Testament era by the Jewish people. And of course, you can still buy the pseudepigrapha, and these books are fascinating. But they seem to make a similar decision. There's going to be certain books that have a higher level of teaching authority. It doesn't mean you're throwing them all out as having no historical significance or no significance at all. It's just that you are defining which books speak for Christ the most excellently. And so there's no reason to be confused about these non-canonical texts. And if, she mentions a lot of things here, like the Mormon Bible. The Mormon Bible is the King James Bible. What she's talking about, in all likelihood, is the Book of Mormon, which is a book that Joseph Smith, who was a visionary, claims to have received from the prophet Moroni in a vision on gold plates. And it's a history of the Hebrew and Jewish people who crossed over the landmass over into the Americas during biblical times. That's called the Book of Mormon. If you're not Mormon, you probably don't believe in the Book of Mormon, but it's that's what it is. You don't have to be afraid of it, but that lets you know what it is. Most people know the Quran was purported to have been given to the Prophet Muhammad by the Archangel Raphael. I think it's Raphael, might be Gabriel. Forgive me if I don't have the right angel, but that it was dictated to him. And so the Quran became the basis and the sacred text of the Islamic faith. Sacred texts, she talks about those, and this is what we're talking about. When she talks about the sacred texts, it could be talking about all that I've talked about and more. Like she says, the Book of Enoch. We have literally the Book of Enoch, which is this really fascinating text about his mystical journeys into the upper and lower spheres. The Essenes, there's a whole bunch of books that were recently released in the last half a century and translated by Edmond Bordeaux-Szekely on the Gospels of the Essenes. I find them fascinating. Lost Books of the Bible and Forgotten Books of Eden. Very interesting additions to the books in our Bibles, but again, not canonical. So they are not of teaching authority. doesn't mean they are of no historical authority, or not authority, but historical interest is what I mean. And then you also have the sacred text, which applies to anything and everything that has been written by any of the prophets, saints, mystics, sages, or ascetics from throughout time. That can apply to things like the dialogues of St. Catherine of Siena, the holy teaching of Vimalakirti. That can be, the writings of Imam Ghazali. All of those things would be among the ancient sacred texts, along with what we would look as possible sacred scripture. And so what this reader is talking about is in relation to the spiritual texts, is that it's sad that so many have missed out on so much of these things because they are gold, is what I think she's saying. And so for those who may be non-Catholic Christians in our audience, there's nothing to be afraid of with these. These are just other historical writings. Some of them are historical sacred writings. What's interesting too is a lot of people don't know, like, for instance, the book of Revelation in our Christian Bible, which was written by St. John, that before that book was canonized in the early church, there is another book that was actually used instead of that book of Revelation. It was called the Pastor of Hermas. It's in the writings of the early church fathers, and it is a fascinating text. And that was actually more popular than the book of Revelation in the first 300 years of the church. And it's actually kind of surprising that it didn't end up in the canonical version of the New Testament. But this is all stuff that you get into when you start understanding how canons are formed. So this is not something you need to be afraid of. These are not things you need to be afraid of. If you're interested in just understanding the historical background of your faith, the historical background of Christ, all of these things help you to understand them. In the non-canonical texts of the Christian Bible, we find that there are acts of every single apostle. Every single apostle wrote a book of the Acts of Peter, the Acts of Paul, the Acts of Thomas. They all have one, and they all have a book of Revelation. They all have an apocalyptic book. Every single one of the apostles. And they all have, I'm not sure if they all have a gospel, but they do, a lot of them do. And you know what is fascinating? There is a Gospel of Peter, which was kept out of the canon of the Bible. Let me tell you why. It was kept out of the canon because Peter's perception of the crucifixion was that Christ suffered no pain. And that did not support the salvific suffering doctrines that the Catholic Church believed at the time. But we can look at that very easily historically, and you can read Peter's conception and what he believed. You can read the other reactions of the other apostles to the crucifixion, and you can see that each one of them had a different psychological reaction to a very traumatic event. And considering what Peter went through and that he denied his Lord 3 times, it might have been the only way for him to get through that, is to believe that he didn't suffer. And so we understand that if we look at it from a human perspective rather than deifying Peter. Peter is someone of great holiness, but the reason he was so holy is because he was so human. That's why Christ chose him. And so there's so much to understand and know about these things. And I encourage all of you, if you're interested in all these things, there is so much to study. Don't leave purgatory, reincarnation, or the the canonical and non-canonical texts of the Bible left unstudied. There is no shortage of books out there that can inform you and give you more information on all of those things, and I encourage you to do it. There are some great books on reincarnation in the Bible which explain this from the simple understanding of the fact that Jews believed in reincarnation and still do in this particular sect, from the fact that Jews always prayed for the dead, and that comes from the book of Maccabees, which is a Jewish book and is in the Jewish canon, which the Protestants took out subsequently 1562 years later, and that also at that same time, there was a change made to the actual wording in the book of St. James in the Protestant Bible to change it to sola scriptura, which is scripture alone, versus it is by faith and our works. They changed that. And they did that in part to support, again, the doctrine they believed in and were forming. And so all of these are human things that we experience every single day. People make these decisions based on their own human thinking, but it's helpful to know how they came to be, isn't it? And it's also very important to know that knowing what it is it's nothing to be afraid of. It's actually helpful because whatever faith you may be, being informed of it will only strengthen it. So you're going to be fine, even if you have a better understanding of why you believe what you want. So download Protestant Reforms, outofbodytravel.org, Out of Body Books, down in the overview series, and you can find out quite a bit of information about tons of different denominations, why they came to be, what they believed, and their confessions of faith that will help you immensely on a lot of these questions. And look for the videos I'm going to be doing here on some more specific questions for our non-Catholic Christians. Thank you so much for this fantastic question, and I hope you guys have a great day.